I'm Julie Zenner, and here's what's coming up on Almanac North. This summer marks the 100th anniversary of the ratification of the 19th Amendment, granting women the right to vote. We'll talk with area women in politics and hear from the author of a new book about an African-American Minnesota woman who was prominent in the nation's suffragist movement. Coming up next on this special edition of Almanac North. Hello and welcome to Almanac North. Dennis is off this week as we alternate hosting the program during the pandemic. This week's show was recorded on Thursday afternoon. And our focus this week is on women and the vote. As the country recognizes the centennial of the 19th Amendment, we hear from local, state, and national office holders who are women. We also want you to know that an upcoming PBS special from American Experience offers a closer look at that historic time. Here's a preview of that program.
They risked their safety.
5,000 women marching, and surrounding them were 100,000 men.
Their freedom.
Black women have a stake in this question.
Their lives.
A hunger strike was taking it to the next level.
To make their mark on history.
Textbooks said women were given the vote. We weren't given anything. We took it.
American Experience presents The Vote.
And joining us now in the studio is the Senate Minority Leader of the Wisconsin Legislature, Janet Bewley. And thanks for being here. Really appreciate you coming in.
Oh, I'm so glad to be here.
Now, Wisconsin holds a historic place in the fight for women's rights and the ratification process. Speak to that a little bit.
Well, you know, think about how long it took to get to the time when we are ready as a nation to allow women to vote. Long, years and years and years, but when it finally comes and it's going to happen, suddenly everybody's on board and everybody wants to be the first state to ratify it. So each of the states have to go through their own process with their legislature to ratify the vote, and Wisconsin wanted to be first. But they were competing, I believe it was with Illinois, and they kind of knew who was going to get it, and there was an actual horse race to get it to the Capitol and have it stamped and registered at the very, very end. And there was a little bit of deliberation, but indeed Wisconsin ended up being first. But I find that so funny because you fight and fight and fight, and because they were prevented, but then at the very end, oh, I was the first one, you know, this is kind of strange.
That is exciting and interesting. How is the state recognizing the 100th anniversary?
The First Lady is chairing a wonderful committee that is going to give many opportunities for celebrating the suffragist movement. There were many things planned, lots of elaborate celebrations, and of course in the time of COVID, we have to do it very differently. But Mrs. Evers and a great group of people have a lot of things on the website, which is the vote.gov on the Wisconsin website. But we are trying to find women that are champions of the suffragist movement, actually women who worked to get the vote, but then also women who stood up and proved that women are indeed equal. It was because the right to vote means that you are equal. It means that you indeed have the same rights as any other human being in the country. And it is still so amazing to me to think that we've only had the right to vote for 100 years. That's all.
Well, now you certainly reflect that spirit in your current leadership position in the legislature. Do you feel a passion or a sense of responsibility to carry on the work of those early suffragists?
Absolutely, and both components of what we're talking about, both women in government, having women step up and serve in public office, run for public office, and to have everyone, men, women, everyone vote. The importance and the significance of the vote, because our nation is built on the premise that we, the people, are going to make the decisions, and the way that we do it is the vote. It's a really exciting time, and it's great, even in the time of COVID, it's great to celebrate it.
Any message to younger women or girls who might be considering voting for the first time, or who might be considering entering political life?
Just know that every step you take is going to lead you to the next one. When you vote, you are going to feel a new sensation of participation in government, and it can lead you to another next step of wondering if you could serve on a committee, or perhaps I can work on a campaign for someone that I like, or how do they make decisions in City Hall? It opens up the curiosity of how do we govern ourselves? Because it's just us. You know, we are the ones who do it, and we have to understand what it is and realize that we can become engaged in our government.
All right, well, thank you for coming in. Senator Janet Bewley coming in and participating in this and engaging in the conversation. We appreciate it. Always good to have you here.
My pleasure.
Thank you. And for more on Wisconsin's remembrance of the centennial, go to womenvotewi.wi.gov. Well, earlier this week, we spoke with Minnesota U.S. Senator Tina Smith for her insights on the women's vote and what inspires her.
Well, you know, I think of the scope of women's suffrage, and I think first of my grandmother, Avis Iden Mason, who was born in 1898. So she was about she was just a young woman when the right to vote, when women first earned the right to vote. So I think about the difference that made in her life. She ended up being the president of a small community bank in northern Indiana, where she was from, and was a real leader in her community. Imagine if she couldn't vote. And then I think about my mom, who was such a community activist, and she got really involved in the League of Women Voters, which grew out of the part of the suffragette movement, the women's suffrage movement. Of course, that was by the time she was involved in the League, it was in the 1970s. And then here I am in the United States Senate, one of only 26 women in the United States Senate. And the power of women's voices and women's votes to change this country, move this country forward, seems more important now than ever. The women's vote is decisive. Women vote in high numbers, but the women that don't vote end up also being really important. We can see that women's views about how to move our society forward, the importance of paid family leave, the importance of living wages for families, the importance of good childcare are things that women care about across the board, especially women who don't vote care about those issues. So the taking that step and making your voice heard and voting, whether it's absentee or on election day, is so important if you care about those issues. Well, I think about it in terms of never taking for granted the right to vote, that the right to vote is something that you exercise, you use. Voting is all about action and using your voice. And in this moment in our country's history, when there are sadly so many efforts to disenfranchise people, to take away their, to suppress their right to vote, it feels particularly important to stand up and to go and to use your voice, not only in the ballot box, but certainly in the ballot box. I became involved in community organizing at the grassroots level, running around with my kids in a stroller and knocking on my neighbors' doors and talking to them about the issues. It was a state legislative race that I first got involved in. I never actually had a big ambition to run for office. I just wanted to be a part of making my community better and connecting with my neighbors. And of course, that led me to working in City Hall. It led me to work at Planned Parenthood on women's health issues, and ultimately it led me to the Senate. So that, at the end of the day, is what motivates me. I'm a at heart, I'm a grassroots organizer, and I believe that the best ideas are going to come from people that are closest to the work. And what gets me going is trying to lift up those voices here in Washington.
The suffragist movement engaged women of all races, often leading to conflict, but also helping bring issues of race to the forefront. The story of an influential African-American suffragist from Minnesota is told in a new book by author William Green. Dr. Green, for viewers who might be unfamiliar with Nellie Francis, could you just give her a brief introduction for us?
Yeah. Nellie Francis is a native of Nashville, Tennessee. She and her family moved to Minnesota, St. Paul in particular, in the mid-1880s. And she would be a resident of Minnesota, St. Paul, for the next 40-some years.
How did Nellie first become interested in women's suffrage?
I think it goes back to the kind of upbringing that she had from her parents. Her father was one of the first Blacks to be elected to the city council in Nashville soon after Reconstruction. And I think that her parents spoke a lot, and her grandmother, who she got really close to, she would survive. The grandmother survived till age 117. They spoke a lot about racial pride, and they spoke a lot about equality. And so I think that the whole notion of women's suffrage was just sort of a logical progression for her. It was not only about dignity, but it was about equality and self-empowerment. It wasn't just about race, but it was about acquiring the skills to be a full citizen as a woman. And she saw it as wrong that women should be excluded from that.
Now, shortly after the battle for the women's vote was won in Minnesota, there was the horrific lynching in Duluth. This year we are commemorating that with the Clayton Jackson McGee events. Nellie Francis was really moved by that and was a key driver in a quest for anti-lynching legislation. Speak to that a little bit, Professor.
Yeah, well, she had also been very active in anti-lynching work, policies and whatnot. She was one of the leaders to ban Birth of a Nation in St. Paul for that reason. And a lot of her speeches were given towards dealing with anti-lynching actions and behavior in politics and whatnot. They went hand in hand. Women's suffrage and anti-lynching work went hand in hand. The women's suffrage ratification certificate was signed by the governor of the state, Governor Burnquist, in 1919. So less than a year later, you have these lynchings in Duluth, which affirmed to a lot of African-American women, we're going to see this again. This is Reconstruction all over again. You know, once we talk about women's suffrage or any kind of suffrage, we're going to see an uptick in white supremacy and violence against the race. And what Nellie had to do was to not only deal with the energy around fighting lynching, but also doing that within the context of inspiring Black women to use the ballot for the first time. So she's kind of dealing with two different forces, sometimes going in opposite directions. She not only played an active role in making lynching a crime, she drafted the legislation with her husband and lobbied the legislature to get the thing passed. Here, Clara Yulin and others, Emily Noyce, for example, and others, played a very important role. They contributed their organizational skills, lobbying skills, to Nellie's movement to get an anti-lynching law passed. So what Nellie had learned and acquired from the lobbying effort to get suffrage through, she was able to transfer into getting the anti-lynching law passed. And success of that in 1921 was that all but one legislator in both houses, only one legislator voted against the anti-lynching bill. She was successful in doing that. But Nellie was the one who spearheaded that effort.
Why was it important to you to tell her story, and what's the message that you hope it conveys to today's audience as we look back at historic events like the passage of the women's vote and like the lynching that took place in Duluth?
Well, I think that there are a lot of lessons. Obviously, it's important to be engaged. It's important to fight against a sense of powerlessness. It's important to take seriously what is happening with other corners of the community, even though one may not belong to it. And in addition, with regard to Nellie, she was a person who oftentimes inspired as much adversity, as much jealousy as she did admiration. She was oftentimes by herself in her struggles. She didn't often have a lot of support from her own community. And that did not dissuade her from moving forward. So a lot of her accomplishments, I think all of her accomplishments are due to her own sense of intestinal fortitude, so to speak, to go it alone if need be, but to do so because it was the right thing to do. I think for that reason, she's my hero. This is a person who knew 3 presidents. This is a person whose home, who knew not only Booker Washington and Du Bois and Ida Wells and all of these giants in civil rights, but she was close to the women's movement as well, and she knew that it was difficult to bring Black women and white women together, and that she would be attacked for it, and she did it anyway. She did it anyway, while taking care of the people she loved. That's the other thing. She remained very close to her family. Mm-hmm. I think it was from her family where she got grounded and where she would be revitalized and healed from the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune. But she shows me the value of loving the people who love you. Never forgetting the significance of family. So those are the kinds of things I take from her. Those are the kinds of reasons why I think it's important for us to know Nellie.
All right. Well, Dr. Bill Green, author of Nellie Francis, Fighting for Racial Justice and Women's Equality in Minnesota, thank you for bringing this story back into the light. We appreciate it and appreciate you taking the time to visit with us.
Thank you for the invitation.
Well, 2 of the current city councilors in Duluth are women of color. With us is 5th District Councilor Janet Kennedy and Councilor from the 4th District, Renee Van Nett. And welcome. I posed the same question to both of you, and maybe I'll start with you, Janet. In the context of the 19th Amendment and its passage 100 years ago, what does it mean for a woman of color to be in politics today?
Yeah, it's been an amazing experience. And I'm very humbled to be able to serve our community and to serve as the first African heritage woman on the City Council of Duluth. I think back to 1920 when the women had the opportunity to vote. But for people of color, that didn't happen for quite a few years. If I have my dates right, it's 1965. So there was a gap there. And so when I serve my community as an African heritage woman, I also serve my community of the 5th District and understand the gaps and how long sometimes it takes to make sure we have policies that work for everyone. So I'm very humbled and really important that we talk about our council right now, and that it's one of the most diverse councils, I believe, in the history of Duluth. And I say I believe, but I believe it is true, and I believe we're all really proud of that, and I'm proud to serve with Councilor Van Nett.
Mm-hmm. Renee?
Yes, along the same lines, we're really historically moving, and I hate to be really biased about ourselves, but I just am. We just are doing amazing work with each other in the city. And for Native women, being the first Native woman to be elected in a diverse town and a diverse district, and being cognizant for myself about my values and where I come from, and then serving the district itself is not just Native people or African American folks, it's a lot of different people. So for me, having to figure out how to play the game and work the game and well enough to get elected, to be elected, stay elected, and do the work for the city that we need, and then have great relationships across the board. And it's amazing to work with Councilor Kennedy because we get to, I don't have to say everything. She can say stuff, and I've said stuff, and I'm like, thank you. I don't need to say that. It's such a breath of fresh air to have this kind of diverse voices on the council.
Mm-hmm. And is it making a difference in terms of removing barriers and bringing more equality to have that diversity of voices sitting at the table?
In my perspective, I think it is, although a challenge and feels uphill a lot, but I think it definitely is, and it can look different to other folks, but to me and the community I represent and people I come from, they say that you're making a difference even though it's hard.
Mm-hmm. As you look at the 100-year anniversary, how important is it for women today, and particularly women of color, to exercise their right to vote?
Yeah, it's important for everyone to exercise their right to vote, no matter what your culture, your heritage, man, woman, GLBTQ community. As soon as you're able to vote, you need to vote. The thing is if you don't vote, somebody else is going to vote for you. So, it's something that we've carried. My mom has carried that value, and I want to carry that value through our community and how I'm serving, but also to encourage people to not only vote, but also run for office, especially if you're a woman of color. And I really value my District 5 community where I grew up, and look forward to building policies that work for everyone.
Councilor Van Nett, we have about 30 seconds, but any words of advice for girls or young women of color who are coming up as it relates to either voting or running for office?
Do it. Ask for advice. Ask people who've done it. Figure out how to do it, and just jump right in, because that's the only way to figure out how to run. It's scary and it's all those things, but it's worth doing it. It's worth it, because your children, their women, other women get to see us doing this, and they want to be there one day, but they're not sure how. And so ask for guidance and do it.
All right, Councilor Van Nett, Councilor Kennedy, thank you so much for coming in.
Thank you.
We really appreciate hearing your perspective.
Appreciate it.
Thanks. The national organization League of Women Voters descended directly from the suffragist movement. Today there are active chapters in communities across the country. Sue Donaio from the League of Women Voters, thank you so much for joining us. First question, I guess, would be, how historically is the League of Women Voters tied to the women's suffrage movement?
It came directly from it. In fact, it was organized 6 months before the ratification of the 19th Amendment, as people who'd worked for decades got it organized. And part of the argument that women should not have the right to vote is they didn't have the mental capacity to do that. How could they possibly know the intricacies of all of this to be able to vote? And so the League of Women Voters was organized to prepare them to be good, solid voters who were knowledgeable about their issues, and get it ready so that there could not be that, I suppose, the kind of clapback of, see, we told you, you didn't know what you were doing. and so it's all become about educating women to be knowledgeable voters.
Mm-hmm. Has the purpose and the mission behind the League of Women Voters changed over the years, or has it remained pretty much the same as that original focus?
I think it's stayed pretty much the same. I think if anything has changed, it's been attention to including minorities into the fold early on. In fact, it just has come out in the last year that one of the main leaders publicly spoke for white supremacy. And the black suffrage movements in the early 1900s and the parades weren't allowed in the parade because they didn't want to antagonize any white voters.
Mm-hmm.
So that's kind of an ongoing thing, but I would, certainly recently in the last few decades, I would say very intentional of making it a wide umbrella.
Mm-hmm.
And that's politically too. It's not just one, bipartisanship is a very strong piece of Women's League of Women Voters.
Are you seeing a lot of young women who are interested in joining the organization these days?
I am always surprised and pleasantly surprised. I'm of Facebook friends of young women who are saying, join the League, because if you want to get political change, this is, get involved, get people registered to vote. And I think in the last 4 years, we've had a lot of younger women come in, active and ready to go.
Mm-hmm. Now, you've been very involved with Minnesota History Day, which engages students in choosing topics to study and do presentations and boards on. Are young people still interested in the 19th Amendment and the suffragette movement?
Every year we have a lot, or the people, male and female students will come. I want to do something to do with women's rights. And gay rights is another one that's a big topic that they want to do something about that. This year in Duluth, we had a high school student from East who got our first ever national championship from Duluth Public Schools. And her paper was on the person who wrote or was the instigator of Title IX.
Mm-hmm. Now, as you look at the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment and women's right to vote and talk with women today, what work do you think still remains to be done?
Well, the first thing is not to take anything for granted. Things that we thought, when I go back to my History Day projects, you have to show what the long-term impact was. I think things that we thought were long-term impacts that are done are now in question again. Voting Rights Act information. Lots of women's rights, period. Mm-hmm. There's just a lot of things, so not to take it for granted. And then as it's coming out now, especially with the Black Lives Matter, is get involved. Don't just say, oh, it's just the local election. Well, now we know what a difference it makes who your governor is, who your attorney general is. Or who your judges are. It's important, and to get out there for all levels. So, registering them when they're in high school, as soon as they turn 18, making sure that they make the effort to get there.
So what do you think the next 100 years will look like in terms of empowering women?
Well, I think we're going to see more women in elected positions, in leadership positions. So 100 years ago, they didn't think women had the intelligence, that they needed to be protected, that the language of the Declaration of Independence says it's all men, it's not women. We're kind of getting past a lot of these things. So I think, well, it's hard to imagine what our country will look like in 100 years. So, but I'm hopeful that there'll be more women along the way, and maybe 100 years from now, it won't matter at all. It won't even be like, so what, male or female, we don't care.
Well, Sue Donaio, League of Women Voters, thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate you taking some time to visit with us and share some insights.
All right.
Thanks for the work you do.
Thank you.
And you can follow Almanac North on our social media sites. You will find us on Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter, and visit the WDSC website to watch past episodes of our show or download the PBS video app. And remember, the two-night special, The Vote on American Experience, premieres on July 6th at 8 p.m. on PBS North and is also available to stream on pbs.org and on the PBS video app. Thanks to our guests and to the crew here at Almanac North. I'm Julie Zenner. Stay healthy, everyone. We'll see you next time.